I'm speaking to K Lyn Wurth, author of The Not So Quiet Life of Calamity Jane, published January 20th, 2021 by Five Star Publishing. Thank you for speaking with me.
Well, thank you for having me.
And I'll start by noting you in your email you did note that usually I interview fantasy, sci-fi, and horror authors, which is correct. However, this podcast is about fiction, about the creation of fiction in all its forms, and I do love other types of fiction, historical novels, westerns, mystery, thrillers. So I'm glad to be speaking to you about this novel. First, as a writer with all the ideas going through your head, how did this idea, this historical novel of Calamity Jane, rise above the rest?
Well, I have had for a long time an interest in stories of the frontier and the American West. And I studied it actually as a grad student, the Great Plains and Western literature.
Hmm.
So I was, of course, familiar with Calamity Jane and many Western stories. But then I joined an organization called Women Writing the West,
Hmm.
where we delve into thinking about how women's stories were told in the Western narrative. And I was at a conference and chatting with some friends about different famous Western women.
Hmm.
And it just became clear to me that although much had been said about Calamity Jane throughout history, I had not read a story about her that really delved into her whys and who she really was.
Hmm. Oh, interesting. Yeah, I would think that, yeah, considering how famous she is, I would have thought that had been done, but I guess you're stepping into new territory then.
Well, it had been done, and many times and in many different ways. And I think that at first fascinated and then frustrated me because it seemed the more that was said about her, the less that was clear.
Hmm, interesting. So, tell me then about this novel. Where does it go through her whole life, or a segment of her life, or what's your approach?
Yes, it begins in her childhood, which very little is known about her. We do know where she was born, and that she was in a family that was not well regarded in her community
Hmm.
in Missouri. The family headed west when Martha Jane was about 6 years old,
Mhm.
and there are just little pinpoints of information. I relied heavily on biographies and scholarship by those greater than myself, especially Richard Edelane and James McLaird, who
Yeah.
were historians who delved deeply into where Martha Jane was at different points in her life.
Mhm.
So I followed what I considered to be key moments and places where she had been located in the historical record.
Mhm. Okay. Um, Now how much so obviously you did do some research for this, but can you go into more detail about the research you did for this novel?
As I said, most of my research was standing on the shoulders of others. I
Mhm.
have been to many of the places
Mhm.
that I speak of in the novel because of my travels throughout the West.
Mhm.
But I really depended on the legwork of these scholars because
Mhm.
they had gone into the newspapers, into the court records, into the official documents, marriage licenses, all these things had already been done. So there really wasn't much left for me to do.
What, so what places did you go to or had you been to that are part of her life?
Well, of course, Deadwood is a classic place in South Dakota where she is legendary, and I've been there. Yellowstone Park, which of course wasn't a park then, but I've spent some time there. And I grew up in the West. I grew up in Colorado.
Hmm.
I'm a mountain girl. So writing about the landscape of the West, which was so much a part of Martha Jane's self,
Mhm.
came very naturally to me.
Mhm.
I've of course I've lived in South Dakota, spent a lot of time there.
Mhm.
So yeah, just generally the West was a big deal to Martha Jane
Mhm.
and to me.
So what, for people who aren't familiar with the character, what is it about her that made her famous? What did she do?
Well, it depends on who you ask, and I think this is where it became interesting.
Mm,
She was atypical for her age. She was probably more comfortable in the company of men than she was with women.
mhm,
She was pretty rowdy. She often dressed as a man, although there are many really interesting photos of her where she seemed to be trying to style herself as very feminine as well. But she partied a lot. She was a drinker. She was what we would definitely call an alcoholic. But she became famous also by association with Wild Bill Hickok and Charlie Utter
mm,
and other famous characters of the West. And many people see her as primarily a sidekick to those sorts of people, but I see her as fascinating in her own right.
mhm. Were there, and I'm not trying to create any controversy or something, but,
Oh, that's okay.
were there parts in the research where, um, as a woman writing about a female character, did you see in past, historical research, maybe because it's dominated by male historians, did you find anything that you said, "Hmm, wait a minute," "As a woman, I realized that this is actually the case, or this is more likely than what they concluded."
Yes, and I won't name the names of the magazines, but there were some magazine articles that I read where they largely dismissed Martha Jane and by saying, "Oh, she was only a prostitute," and I found that pretty irritating, honestly, because I think that's one way that women were just categorized in the Western narrative when the reality of what they were experiencing may have involved selling themselves at some point, but that doesn't mean they are just a prostitute. And this is one of the things that we do in Women Writing the West is we try to take a closer look at what women were doing, how they were surviving in what was almost completely a man's world.
Mhm,
So I wanted to run counter to that narrative a little bit, even if the historical research did not prove, but suggested it's possible that there was some prostitution in her life.
mhm. Do you think, right now that, a character, looking at her in this way, it's more, people are more accepting now, would be more interested in looking at, the various angles of her life?
Yes, I think people generally are a little more open to something not being just purely a black and white
Mhm,
moral question. I think they're more open to the subtleties and also the complexities of what it is to survive as a woman in different periods in history. So yeah,
mhm,
I think it's a great time to kind of come out and say, this was a very complicated person. This
mm,
wasn't just a simple case.
mhm. What about how often, so I guess her life was unusual, but as far as sort of the circumstances and what she went through, where did you find other, women in this period who, like, how commonplace was what she experienced, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I think, given that her family traveled west
Mhm,
to find a better life, that was very common. The fact that they fell on really hard times when they got to the Montana Territory and suffered a great deal of poverty
mhm,
uh, was very typical. I think the fact that many children did end up neglected and abused, as I theorize about Martha Jane,
mhm,
I think that was also very common because these dreams that people had of making it big in the camps almost took a terrible toll on a lot of families. So I
mhm,
think in her beginnings, it was very typical for families to suffer for their journey west.
mhm,
And then as she tried to make her way through the aftermath of that, it probably was very typical for young girls to end up working as servants at a young age, as she did, uh, to have to resort to some shady ways of getting by to
mhm.
survive because there were not a lot of options.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's kind of funny, we call it the Wild West, but I think sometimes people forget it's just as wild for women as it was for the men?
It really was. And I think women had to be pretty resourceful and resilient. And I found that in Martha Jane. She she was delightful in her getting up and getting started again every time something went wrong. And yet she also suffered from addiction. So you can't overly romanticize her as a heroine either.
Mhm. I'm speaking with K Lyn Wurth, author of The Not So Quiet Life of Calamity Jane. You can find more information about her work at klynworth.net. If you like this episode of Full Contact Nerd interviews so far, please tap the like button and hit the subscribe button. If you want interviews with writers and creative people or daily book suggestions in sci-fi, fantasy, horror, film history, gaming, and more, check out fullcontactnerd.com and my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews. If you want to hear interviews with military historians or get daily history book suggestions, check out warscholar.org and my podcast, Military History Inside Out. If you want to hear interviews with space scientists, space historians, and technology experts, or get daily space and science book suggestions, check out technologyandspace.com and my podcast, Technology and Space. All of my social media links are listed at the end of this episode. Now back to the video. What years did she live?
Well, she was born in 1856.
Hmm.
She actually lied and said that she was older than that, which is an interesting comment on her character.
Hmm.
And it's possible that she did that to try to make herself more deeply embedded in the Western narrative. She wanted to be part of the old Wild West. So she made herself older than she was so that she was part of that history.
Interesting. And when did she die?
1903
Hmm.
in Terry, South Dakota. She didn't live a long time. People believed she was much older than she was when she died
Hmm.
because she had been pretty ravaged by alcoholism at that point.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the things, so obviously you're into Western history and culture, but what are some of the other things that inspire you? And that can be books, music, film, TV, anything out there.
Oh, well, I play guitar
Okay.
when I was younger, and I do enjoy playing guitar.
Hmm.
Um, I have a background in visual arts,
Okay.
so I have some things back here that I've done. I guess I'm pretty devoted to the arts in general.
Hmm.
That keeps me cycling through creatively. If I get stuck in one area, I go do something else for a while.
Okay. What do you like to play on the guitar? What sort of music?
Well, I've gotten more into just more contemporary fingerstyle guitar. I love Peppino D'Agostino's music. He's an Italian American that I saw actually at a music fair in Minnesota. It was a wonderful outdoor concert, and I was just hooked on his music. I also have a favorite musician named Vin Downs,
Hmm.
who lives out in Bayonne, New Jersey, and he has some beautiful music. So I try to play their compositions. It's
Hmm.
a good challenge for me.
Hmm. Do you generally, doing these various artistic things, do you not watch a lot of TV then? Are you one of those who is more about working on personal projects than
Oh,
watching?
I love movies. I really love movies, and I find it fascinating to to read a book and then see a movie, and then sometimes I'm upset because I feel like they didn't do right by the book, or vice versa. But I do enjoy movies a lot, and I think my writing is probably very visual as a result of that.
Mhm. What, so stepping back to the book, what did you, so doing the research you did, looking
Mhm.
at what's been said, is there anything you came across that really surprised you about the character that you didn't know about before?
Yes, I was not aware that she was a mother.
Hmm.
That was a surprise to me, and I there were a few notes in the historical record that led me to feel that was reliable enough information that I could develop it in the fiction.
Mhm.
So that was one surprise. The fact that she had such a problematic relationship with her sister,
Mhm.
that was interesting to me. Um, I think there were many surprises about Martha Jane. She had been so glossed over in as Doris Day in the 50s. There was such an image of her as this rowdy, happy person.
Yeah.
But then when you get into the reality of it, there are court documents that show that she was a victim of domestic violence,
Hmm.
which was surprising. She just, at every turn, it seemed like I was surprised by Martha Jane, and it just pulled me more and more into trying to find her voice.
Hmm. Did she write anything herself, or is it more about other people writing about her contemporaries?
Well, this was another thing that I found out about her, is that she was most likely not even able to write her own name.
Hmm.
There's no evidence that she could read or write, which called into question many wonderful stories about her where they have her writing letters to people or writing about herself. She did have an autobiography, a pamphlet that she sold on the street corners for money for alcohol,
Hmm.
but it's believed that she just walked into a printer and gave an oral account, which was mostly lies.
Hmm.
And that's the other thing about Martha Jane. You couldn't trust a thing she said, but she did have this pamphlet that she sold that
Hmm.
was pretty much verbatim her street corner performance that she
Hmm.
did. And she was a performer.
Hmm. Interesting. I guess in a sense, even the lies she told kind of reveals something about her character.
It's a big part of my story is that there was a reason that she lied, and maybe more than one reason. I think one reason I already touched on, and that's because she wanted to embed herself in the narrative of the West that she loved.
Hmm.
But I think some of it was a way of reclaiming herself and her voice, because first of all, she'd had a terrible childhood, and who wants to dwell on that? So why not dress it up and say, I was an adventurer. I led my family west in the wagon train,
Right.
Yeah. But also, she was written about so much in the newspapers,
Hmm.
and so many things were said about her. I believe there must have been a part of her that said, I'm going to tell my story.
Hmm.
Even if it's not true, I'm going to have my version.
Yeah. Because I imagine the papers were making up their own stories too.
Oh, and dime novels were being written about her, even while she was alive. Not that she could read them, but she would hear about these things, that she
Yeah.
had been an Indian fighter or she had gone on this expedition. And some of those things she folded into her own narrative because, hey, that's a good story.
Yeah.
But I think she did live trapped between social rejection on the one hand because she did not behave as women were supposed to behave.
Hmm.
And then this celebrity where other people were profiting from her story
Hmm.
and she didn't have any part of that. And she lived in the middle. So,
Yeah.
I think she took what she could.
So considering there are a lot of gaps in her life, was there a particular gap or question that you had that you really were hoping to get an answer for and either finally did, or maybe you're still curious, something that really sticks out for you?
You know, th- this was a lot like playing dot to dot, those puzzles we used to do when we were kids. And I found myself filling in a lot of gaps.
Mhm.
But I always tried to do that with at least some mention in a historical record. Her motherhood, I think, will always be a mystery to me.
Mhm.
The Without giving too much away, there were two children mentioned
Mhm.
in the record. The second of those grew up to be a young woman who actually thought that Martha Jane was her grandmother, which
Mhm.
puzzled me because how do you grow up thinking that your mother is your grandmother? So I worked with that and I did the best I could with it.
Right.
Um, at some point, there was an abandonment of that child, and I had to wrestle with that too.
Mhm.
What was really going on? So that will always probably remain an unsettled question in me, although I did try to answer it in a believable way.
Even if she were a completely fictitious character, just the stuff you're talking about would still be fascinating to read,
Oh,
you know?
there's no end to it. As I finished this way of telling her story, I felt very satisfied with it, but I realized I could probably go back into the records pick a completely different set of events
Mhm.
and tell another whole version of her life, because there's enough mention of where she was and what she was doing. It's fascinating to explore.
Mhm. And not to, again, I don't want you to reveal anything, but was there any particular thing you discovered that had a really strong emotional impact on you, either positive or negative?
Yes, the first thing that comes to mind is the fact that she was a battered wife.
Mm,
That truly impacted me. I had not realized uh, any of that about her, but there were court records where she faced her accuser, and that was shocking. And yet, it brought her very much into focus for me because I know many women who have suffered that as
mm,
well.
mhm. Now let me turn to, your writing process. Uh, is there anything, or actually, let me step back. There is one more question I wanna ask
Okay.
about the book. Um, Looking at the aesthetic or the tone or the feel of the book, what would the musical soundtrack to the book be if it had one?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, it would have to be an old style, probably an old style dance tune
Mm,
from the late 1800s,
mm,
because I saw Martha Jane as a person who would be most at home in a saloon with the guys,
mhm,
drinking, dancing, having a very good time. And I tried to capture some of that music in the language of the book. This is not written in a scholarly tone. I tried to take seasonings of the dialect or the what would have been the slang of the day without overdoing it so
mhm.
that it became too much. But this is a book of a common woman who would much rather dance all night than go to church.
Mhm. Yeah. So was her time as a performer, was that more just work for her, or did you get the sense she enjoyed it? Or was it all just about making money to have fun?
I think there were times when she worked as a dance hall girl.
Mhm,
I don't know how much she enjoyed it, but I have a feeling that she did have a joy in living,
mhm,
especially when she was in her 20s before the alcoholism became the controlling force in her life.
mhm,
There's good reason to believe she would sneak out at night when she was working at a boarding house and was supposed to be a good girl. She would sneak out at night and go dancing. I think Martha Jane had a good sense of fun,
mhm.
and that's why she didn't get along really well with a lot of women, because she wasn't behaving.
Um, so, alright, so your writing process,
Yes.
is there anything out of the ordinary in your mind that you do to either, uh, complete your drafts or the final draft?
Out of the ordinary. I guess the way I do it
Mhm,
and is I tend to do a lot of research up front.
mhm,
And I've heard a lot of people say they just start the story, but I like to surround myself with a sense of place
mhm,
and time and characters. And then when I dive into the person, then the plot comes out of character.
mhm,
I don't start necessarily with a plot. Now, in this case, that was very much true because her plot was already established. I knew how it was going to end. I didn't have a lot of choices as far as the arc of the story.
mhm.
So it was all about going deep into the character. But most of my books are about that, I think.
How about, the creation of side characters in the book? At some point, you have to sort of create people that don't exist. How do you approach that? How do you balance that?
Now, I was fortunate that most of the characters that I was able to include in this story
Mhm,
were real people. Her siblings, I had to fictionalize maybe a couple of them because the historical record wasn't clear,
mhm,
but almost all the characters in this one were real. And that felt important to me
mhm,
because Martha Jane didn't have a lot of consistent relationships in her life. So I tried to really emphasize those that she did have. Now, one of those famous relationships that gets misrepresented a lot is the one with Wild Bill Hickok. So I tried to be as close to the historical record on that as I could be. Fictional characters, I did have a few, just people who probably would have had to shown up to be there for her at given times. They served a purpose, but then it's a matter of trying to be true to that place with them too.
Um, so how you've done a lot of writing. How has your approach to writing changed over time from when did you first start writing?
Oh, well, I began to seriously start to write novels um, in, oh golly, mid 80s,
Mhm.
the mid 80s. When my children were small, I would get up at 3 in the morning and try to write before they woke up.
Wow.
And I had an old IBM typewriter, and I would get up at 3 in the morning and type on the cold front porch. It's a great story, you know. But I really fell in love with writing under the mentorship of one of my professors in college who encouraged me and thought I had a voice.
Mhm,
So how as far as what has changed,
mhm,
I go more deeply into voice
mhm,
probably than I used to. I think I've found a way of exploring characters, and as I said, then finding the plot from, instead of laying out a plot. Like I used to try to write a story and then weave the characters into it. So it's
mhm.
sort of flipped on me.
So when you say, since you have focused on voice, can you go into a little more depth about what you think was lacking and what you think you added over time? I guess I'm trying to get more of a definition of what exactly is voice. It's kind of amorphous maybe, but
Right, right. I write sort of a pretty balanced combination of third person point of view and first person point of view. So
mm,
voice means two things. There's my voice, which comes into the narrative in different ways depending on which part. Now, this book, for example, has some third person point of view sections.
mhm,
And then there are parts that are in Martha Jane's voice, as if she were speaking. All of those have my voice coming through, obviously, with the dialect, with the tone that is the same. So voice, I think, can mean different things when authors talk about it. They can be talking about their own voice as narrator, but in this book, it was especially important to me to think about the character psychologically, to think about her as a person in her time, not in my time,
mhm,
and to think how she would have expressed herself.
mhm.
So
Do you
that's the voice I was really after in this book.
mhm. Do you ever read your writing out loud to see how it sounds to the ear?
All the time, all
Mhm,
the time, because there's a music to it. There
mhm,
has to be a rhythm, and you can't really see that on the page or in your head. So yes, I read aloud a lot.
mhm. What do you write, like, as you're writing it or, like, by paragraph, or do you wait till you finish a whole chapter and then decide to see if it flows smoothly
I
throughout?
usually wait and just let it all come out.
Mhm,
I don't edit much as I go. I just generate
mhm,
and get it all down on the page. And then yes, at the end of the chapter, I go back and I read it out loud and and make a few decisions about it. But there's a thing about momentum, and I think a lot of writers will tell you that if you're on a roll, you don't want to start editing too soon.
mhm.
So
Are you the type to underwrite or overwrite and edit a lot?
that's one thing that has changed also in my writing process. I used to write, 150,000 word drafts and then have to chop a lot out. I
Mhm,
think I'm a little more in control of the narrative now, so I can usually write to the the amount that I feel the story will demand, or that the publisher would want, because that becomes a big issue. If you write 150,000 words, then you have that agonizing process of trying to dispose of it. So I try to avoid that.
How many words is this
I
novel?
think this one is not
Small.
terribly long. I think it came out to be 88,000 words.
Mhm.
So it's about, well, they've got it set up here at about 300 pages.
Right, right.
So, yeah.
I'm speaking with K Lyn Wurth, author of The Not So Quiet Life of Calamity Jane. You can find more information about her work at klynworth.net. If you like this episode of Full Contact Nerd interviews so far, please tap the like button and hit the subscribe button. If you want interviews with writers and creative people, or daily book suggestions in sci-fi, fantasy, horror, film history, gaming, and more, check out fullcontactnerd.com and my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews. If you want to hear interviews with military historians or get daily history book suggestions, check out warscholar.org and my podcast, Military History Inside Out. If you want to hear interviews with space scientists, space historians, and technology experts, or get daily space and science book suggestions, check out technologyandspace.com and my podcast, Technology and Space. All of my social media links are listed at the end of this episode. Now back to the video. Your writing, is it mostly Western focused, or is there a range?
It mostly, yeah, I would say everything I've published at this point takes place either on the Great Plains or the American West.
Mhm.
And that began because I was born in Nebraska, and my family's roots and memories are in the Republican River Valley of Nebraska. And
Mhm.
that's what I started writing about first.
Mhm.
So I started doing the history of that region, found out there was a hellacious flood in that valley at one point. So I wrote about that. And then, as I said, I became involved with this wonderful group of women who write about the West. And
Mhm.
being from Colorado, I felt like I found my group.
Mhm.
So yes, I do mostly focus on the West.
And is it mostly fiction? And it sounds like you've written a little bit of history, like some
Well,
history
it's
articles.
all fiction. It's all fiction, but I do the historical research
Mhm.
to bring around the story.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure if if what you mentioned, like the flood, if that's something you ended up writing an article for
No,
someone. Okay.
no, that just takes place in one of my novels. So
Okay. Okay. Um, how many novels have you written that take place where you grew up?
uh, there are there are 4 Nebraska novels. I just released one last November,
Mhm.
and then this particular book about Calamity Jane is probably the only one that you would call a Western
Mhm.
novel, because it has to do with, the Deadwood and the Old West of the late 1800s.
Okay. Okay. Um, so you mentioned some of the sort of the other stuff you've done. Actually, have you done other work that's influenced how or what you write? Any non-writing work?
Oh wow. Yes, I my first published short story was actually a result of my work as an emergency medical technician
Huh.
in a small town.
Mhm.
And the short story was called The Things You Do. And it was about an ambulance call that well, a fictionalization of an ambulance call that I went on. So
Mhm.
that was one of my first stories when my children were young. I also worked for a short time as a physician's assistant. So I have a background in medical training, which has really influenced my view of people. And you study the psychology, you study the physiology, and you get a whole different view of why people are the way they are. So those things influenced me a great deal.
Do you get into the details of that sort of work in any of your fiction? Like how police procedurals get into details
Right.
about that. Do you ever do that?
I haven't yet, although I think it's very pervasive. For example, Martha Jane uh, took care of patients during the smallpox epidemic in Deadwood. And so having a background in medicine helped me just have a better feeling for what she would be doing to take care of patients.
Yeah.
So that's sort it creeps in, I guess is what I would say. And I do have a character who's a woman doctor in one of the novels.
Okay. And that one that's sort of takes place in contemporary times.
Well, the Nebraska novels take place between 1900 and 1968.
Okay.
Yes, so more contemporary.
Okay. This I generally ask with my fantasy and sci-fi authors, but it could still
Go
apply
ahead.
here.
Sure.
When you were young, was there any did you have any fictional setting or something fantastic that you wanted, some kind of power or a place that you imagined being in or living in?
I lived in a place for a while that seemed very magical and fantastic to me. And it has grown even more so because I never went back. When I was 3 years old, my family moved down to the big thicket area in Texas.
Mhm.
It's a national preserve now, but when we moved down there, if you can imagine a little girl from Nebraska moving into the southeast Texas, where there were snapping turtles and several varieties of poisonous snakes and wild hogs and bios with alligators and it was just epic. And so, I've tried to write about it a few times, but I don't know if I'm enough of a native to really capture it. But I think it gave me a sense of what is strange.
Mhm.
It's whatever you're not used to. I'm sure my friends who grew up there were like, oh yeah, wild hogs, but I was like, oh my gosh. So, and I are interested in pushing the boundaries of what is real and what is not real. And although I didn't do that in this particular book, the one that I published in November was kind of my first venture into a little bit of magical realism,
Ah,
where I love Neil Gaiman.
mm,
I discovered him in the last several years, and he really challenges me to think more about that boundary between what we think we're happening and then where our senses can take us. So
mhm.
yes, I find that more intriguing the older I get.
Interesting. So is Nebraska I imagine as being pretty flat. I've been through it a couple times, but it's just flat with fields extending, you know,
It is
dry.
southern Nebraska, where my family settled. They were there from about the 1930s through the 70s. So they weren't there a long time, but they were in this little river valley, the Republican River. So yes, it's flat as can be. And then all of a sudden you get this wonderful little hilly region where the river goes through. So it's quite charming.
Mhm,
Uh, Lots of history there. The Pawnee
mhm.
were the Native American presence in that area. So I found myself touching on that in the books. But yeah, it's pretty flat in Nebraska.
Yeah, yeah. No, they have a lot of I think both Kansas and Nebraska really like history. You see a lot
Yeah,
of history there.
you do. You do. It's very, very important part of the movement west. There was but it's often overlooked by writers. There's far less writing about Nebraska, say, than there is about Colorado, and I think that challenged me too to go a little more deeply.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah.
So,
So, did you have any difficulties finishing this book or getting it published?
no, this book was so delightful. The only difficulty I had probably was self-inflicted, and that was when I got about two-thirds of the way through Martha Jane's life
Hmm.
and had to face the reality of her basically her self-destruction. I wanted to redeem her somehow. I wanted to, bring some big, wonderful layer of meaning and, something that wasn't real.
Hmm.
And I had to wrestle with that in myself.
Mhm.
And I had to just let Martha Jane be Martha Jane. She made, there are very few things that we have on the record that she actually said.
Mm.
But one of the things that she did say that guided me toward the end was there was a reformer who took charge of Martha Jane late in her life, who was going to straighten her out, dry her out, get her off the whiskey, and get her into a productive life.
Mm.
And Martha Jane went along with it as long as it was profitable. But then she finally said, I want you to just let me go to hell by my own route.
Mm. Yeah.
So
Uh,
and I felt like she was kind of saying that to me too, as if I was going to take it on myself to be her storyteller,
mhm.
I had to be true to that element of her character and her voice. And I couldn't help but try to give her something that she wanted at the end of her life. But that was Martha Jane. She did not want people telling her what to do.
Mhm. And it sounds like she
So
expected to go to hell no matter what. And she was like,
Well, I don't know if she believed in a physical hell, but I think she was so judged in her life by pious people. I think she just like, just let me go to hell then, it just
"Mm,
worn out with it.
yeah.
As far as the book getting published, I was very blessed because I sent it to one publisher and they accepted it,
Mhm.
which is funny because boy, have I had a lot of rejections in my life. I like to say I've been rejected by the finest publishing houses in the country,
Mhm.
but Five Star was a good fit. So when I sent them the book, they were very gracious to accept it.
Oh, good, good.
Yeah.
Um, so what's your current or next writing project?
Well, I'm currently trying to fall in love with another character, which is very hard after Martha Jane because she really took me on a ride. She was hard to understand. She was challenging in all the right ways. She had all the drama, all the conflict. And it's hard to find an act after her. So
Mm.
I'm still doing a lot of research. I'm looking into one woman who was a pioneer, the first woman to cross the Missouri River uh, very early on. She was back in the 1820s. I don't know. I'm kind of fishing right now. I'd like to say I know exactly what I'm going to do next, but you have to fall in love with, for me, I have to fall in love with a character,
Mhm.
and I'm still working on that. So,
And you said you live in Colorado now?
no,
Oh,
I was in Texas and then I grew up in Colorado. Now I'm in Illinois, which makes the Western thing a little harder. So I'm looking locally for early pioneers who came through Illinois because I like doing the local research if I can.
mhm.
So
'Cause I was gonna ask if you've written anything set in Colorado.
I haven't yet.
Mhm.
And there's, I know many women through my organization I mentioned who write about Colorado and do it so well,
Mhm.
but I haven't yet done
Mhm.
that.
Okay, okay. Um, do you have a presence online? Do you have social media or website?
Yes, I do. It's klynwurth.net.
Mhm.
I have that site. And then I'm on Facebook too.
Mhm.
So, yeah,
And I'll spell that for listeners. It's KLYNWURTH .net, you said, right?
that's correct. Yes, thank you.
Okay. That's all the questions I have. Do you have any, final thoughts or words?
No, I thank you so much for
Mm.
this interview. It's been delightful to talk about Martha. I will say one thing. The readers will notice that I call her Martha Jane
Mm.
at some times and Calamity at other times. And that is intentional
Mhm.
because she had sort of a split identity that was fun to explore. And I hope that readers will enjoy both sides of her.
Mhm. Yeah, I was curious about that. Obviously, you were using her name, but she's known as
Yeah,
Calamity, so I was just
right,
curious about
right.
that.
Yeah, yeah. It's kind
So,
of the private and public personas enter in. So,
yeah. All right, well,
yeah.
thank you for speaking with me.
Well, thank you, Cris. This has been a lot of fun.
In the next episode, I speak with well-known science fiction author Andy Weir about his new novel. space dock the subscribe button to catch that episode. Thank you for watching this video version of Full Contact Nerd Interviews. If you liked the episode, please subscribe and hit the like button. If you'd like more book suggestions or information on fiction and storytelling, including sci-fi, horror, fantasy, mysteries, thrillers, film history, gaming, and more, please check out my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews, my YouTube channel, Cris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd, and my webpage, chrisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. If you're looking for military history and general history, including true crime, please check out my YouTube channel, War Scholar, my podcast, Military History Inside Out, and my webpage, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. If you're looking for space history and the science, technology, and business of space, check out my YouTube channel, Spacewalks Money Talks, my podcast, Technology in Space, and my website, technologyandspace.com. Thank you for watching, and keep imagining the past, the present, and the future.